This wound doesn't come from the enemy. It comes from your own body trying to save itself. When your feet sit in cold water, your body decides that keeping your heart, lungs, and brain warm matters more than keeping your feet alive. So the blood vessels down there clamp shut, and your feet are left running on almost nothing. Tissue that gets no blood gets no oxygen, and it slowly starts to die. The nerves go first, which is why the feet go numb, and then the skin and everything deeper follows. Now, the water is the key part of the recipe, because water pulls heat out of your body somewhere around 25 times faster than air does, so a wet foot keeps draining warmth even when the weather's mild. Standing still makes it worse because moving muscles are what pump blood back up out of your feet. And tight boots make it worse again, since they squeeze off what little circulation you had left. Cold, water, standing still, and tight boots, all working on the same 2 feet for days. That's the whole weapon. And before you think this is just frostbite under a different name, it isn't. Frostbite is your flesh literally freezing, with ice forming inside the tissue, and for that you need temperatures below zero. Trenchfoot needs no ice whatsoever. It happens above freezing. It's been recorded in weather as mild as around 16 degrees Celsius, which is about 60 Fahrenheit. And it doesn't need weeks either. 10 to 14 hours of cold, wet feet can be enough to start the damage, which is exactly why armies kept walking into it over and over, because nobody expects to lose men's feet in weather where you can't even see your own breath. Now, the first doctor to properly describe this thing was Dominique Jean Larrey, Napoleon's chief surgeon, the man who invented the horse-drawn battlefield ambulance. He wrote the first clinical description in 1812 during Napoleon's retreat from Russia, while the army was falling apart and men's feet were turning black. But Larrey had already noticed something strange years earlier, near Eylau in 1807, where his soldiers spent days in hard frost and barely anyone complained about their feet. Then, the weather suddenly thawed, and men's feet gave out all at once, pain, numbness, toes going black. And from that, he worked out something way ahead of his time. The cold sets the injury up, but the worst damage arrives with sudden heat. The men who crowded around campfires with numb feet got gangrene the fastest, so Larry ordered numbed limbs rubbed with snow or camphorated brandy instead of being warmed at a fire. And slow, careful rewarming is still the treatment today, over 2 centuries later. Remember those campfires, because this lesson is going to keep coming back. For the next 100 years, the condition kept showing up wherever soldiers stood in cold water, and it never even got its own name. Army doctors just kept logging it as frostbite, even when the weather was clearly above freezing. In the Crimean War, in the winter of 1854-55, the British Army outside Sevastopol recorded 1,924 cases of quote-unquote frostbite, and 457 of those men died, roughly 1 in 4. And the surgeons noted that most of the damage happened at 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, to men standing in knee-deep mud in badly fitting boots. The next winter, with better food, shelter, and some basic prevention, the same army had 474 cases and 6 deaths. So the answer already existed in 1856. The same story then rolled through the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, the Russo-Turkish War, and the Balkan Wars just before World War I, where Turkish soldiers outside Constantinople developed rock climbing from the toes toward the knee, in air averaging around 5 degrees Celsius. The numbers from these older wars are approximate, but the pattern never changed. Wet feet, above freezing, and men losing their feet or their lives without a single wound on them. So now it's the autumn of 1914. The German advance gets stopped at the Marne, the war of movement dies, and by November there's a continuous line of trenches running from the Swiss border to the North Sea. And the worst possible place to dig on that entire line was Flanders, where much of the British sector sat. That land lies barely above sea level, in the basin of the River Lys, with clay under the topsoil that water can't pass through. So dig down 2 or 3 feet and you hit water. Then the rains came. The Lys rose about 7 feet over its banks, and whole stretches of trench were simply abandoned to the water, with some flooded sections blocked at both ends, bailed out with buckets and held like islands. No duckboards yet, no proper dugouts, and parapets of soaked earth that just dissolved. Men stood in water to the knee, in places to the waist, in leather boots that soaked through and stayed soaked for days at a time, with nowhere to dry anything. In the worst stretches, men had to be relieved twice a day, because nobody could physically last longer. One British soldier, Arnold Ridley, wrote that men got so worn down that lying out in the open under fire felt better than staying in the flooded trench, because death only meant sleep. By January 1915, Sickness in the British First Army alone was averaging around 2,144 men per day. And you can watch the epidemic arrive in the Army's own medical returns, month by month. August 1914, one recorded case of cold injury in France. September 1, October 11, November 1,555, December 4,823. By the end of that first winter, over 20,000 British soldiers had been treated for it, and one battalion lost 400 men in just 2 days, plenty of those cases ending in amputation. At first, nobody even knew what to call this thing. The newspapers back home reported it as an epidemic of frostbite, and names like water bite, mud bite, and trench frostbite got tried before everyone settled on the one that stuck: trenchfoot. And the doctors noticed something that confirmed water, not cold, was the real enemy, because cases peaked in the wet months of October and November, dropped when December froze the water solid, and rose again with the thaw. The freeze was actually the safer weather, if you can believe it. Now here's what it did to a man, stage by stage. First the feet go cold, then numb. And the numbness is the trap, because you stop feeling that anything's wrong at all. Sergeant Harry Roberts described feet so dead that in his words, you could stick a bayonet into them and not feel a thing. Then comes the swelling. Feet blew up to 2 or 3 times their normal size, so swollen that boots couldn't be pulled off and had to be cut away, and once a man's boots were off, he usually couldn't get them back on. So now he's standing barefoot in a flooded trench in the middle of winter. The skin goes red, then blue, then in the worst cases black as the tissue dies. Blisters and open sores follow, and in advanced cases the flesh starts rotting while the man is still alive. That's gangrene, dead tissue decomposing while it's still attached to you. And it has a smell. Men in the trenches could smell it on each other. Once it got that far, there was nothing the doctors could really do. There was no cure, and by the way, there still isn't one. Treatment was rest, feet up, slow drying, and time, because warming the feet quickly made everything worse, which is Larry's campfire lesson all over again, 100 years later. But the cruelest part came with recovery, because when the blood finally crawled back into those deadened nerves, the numbness flipped into extreme pain. And accounts from the casualty stations describe whole wards of trenchfoot cases where men screamed through the night as the feeling returned. For the worst cases, the end of the line was the surgeon. Arthur Savage, a British veteran, remembered men sobbing, and not from the pain, but because their trenchfoot had gone gangrenous and they knew they were about to lose a leg. The luckier ones got months in a hospital in England, and many were never fit for the front again. And the miserable thing is, for the men in the line that first winter, it was close to unavoidable. You held a flooded trench for days, there was nowhere to dry socks or boots, nowhere dry to even sit down. And then the uniform itself joined in against them. Puttees, those long wool strips wound tightly around the leg from ankle to knee, worked like a soft tourniquet, and when they got wet, the wool shrank and squeezed even tighter, strangling circulation in feet already starved of blood. Exhausted men stood dead still on sentry duty for hours, and standing still was exactly what the condition needed to do its work. So, how did the army respond to a disease that was eating its own infantry? Well, the first serious answer wasn't medicine, it was discipline. Trenchfoot got officially declared preventable, so getting it became a failure, either yours or your officers. Units with high numbers were investigated and their commanders held answerable, and this stayed policy for years, because as late as June 1917, 4th Army Standing Order number 595 stated that losses from trenchfoot indicated quote-unquote faulty discipline. Some men were punished directly for their own rotting feet. One private got 7 days punishment for having trenchfoot, which meant extra dangerous and dirty jobs, including work out in no man's land, all while still standing knee-deep in the exact mud and water that caused his condition in the first place. His feet got worse with every round of punishment, and the punishments only stopped when the man was effectively crippled. Freaking brilliant system. Part of the army's suspicion came from the fact that a bad case meant evacuation to England, so to some officers, trenchfoot looked like a ticket home that a man might quietly let himself earn. But you can guess what treating a disease as a crime actually achieved. Men hid their rotting feet until they couldn't walk anymore. What actually worked came in alongside the punishments, a package that turned foot care into a military duty. Feet inspected daily, men paired up in a buddy system, each man made responsible for his partner's feet, drying them and rubbing them with grease, because the army figured out that a man will happily neglect his own feet, but he won't let his mate lose his. And the grease was whale oil, with a single battalion in the line burning through around 10 gallons of it a day. So on top of everything else, the trenches now smelled of fish. Every man carried 3 pairs of socks and changed into dry ones at least twice a day, with fresh socks coming up to the front every night with the rations in waterproof bags. Boots got ordered a size large and laced loose. The puttees eventually got banned in the trenches altogether, and rubber thigh waders were issued for the wettest sectors. Then they rebuilt the trenches themselves to get men out of the water, with duckboards. Those slatted wooden walkways laid along the trench floors, pumps and drainage sumps pulling the water down, braziers and drying rooms behind the lines, and time in the worst flooded stretches capped at 24 to 36 hours. And notice that none of this cured anything. It just kept feet drier for more hours of the day. But that was enough. By the winter of 1917 to 18, cases were down to a fraction of the first winter's flood, even though the army in France was many times bigger. The commonly quoted British bill for the whole war is around 75,000 men hospitalized for trenchfoot and frostbite on the Western Front, the great majority from the first 2 winters. So by 1918, the problem was solved. The answer was written down in orders and manuals, and every army on Earth could read it. Keep that in mind for what comes next. Because 25 years later, the US Army had to learn the whole thing again from zero. May 1943, the island of Attu, out in the Aleutians off Alaska, where American troops landed to take the island back from the Japanese. The fight lasted under 3 weeks, in fog, rain, winds reaching 120 miles an hour and freezing wet tundra, and the troops went in wearing standard leather boots that soaked straight through. The Japanese killed 549 Americans and wounded 1,148. The weather took out over 2,100, including around 1,200 severe cold injuries, most of it trenchfoot. So the weather outfought the enemy garrison, and it got bad enough that some men stripped clothing off dead Japanese soldiers because it was better than what they'd been issued. One American captain summed up the whole disease in one line, saying the ones who suffered were the ones who didn't keep moving, who stayed in their holes with wet feet. The lesson was investigated on the spot, and then it went precisely nowhere. Because that same autumn, when US troops in Italy started going down with trenchfoot in the mountain rains, and the Fifth Army logged more than 5,700 cases in 6 months, the medical office there still had no information about what happened on Attu. The reports written in Italy then traveled so slowly through the system that they reached the command in Northern Europe about a year later. You know, just in time to be useless. Which brings us to the biggest trenchfoot disaster of the 20th century. Autumn 1944, the American armies pushing toward Germany ran into the wettest and coldest European winter in 30 years, and they ran into it unprepared. And this time the cause was a bet made at the top. The supply lines from Normandy were overloaded, so General Omar Bradley chose to haul ammunition and fuel forward instead of winter clothing, gambling that the war would end before winter. He later called it, quote-unquote, a calculated risk. Well, the German front held, the rain kept falling, and the bill landed on the riflemen. The first trenchfoot cases were reported on November 9, 1944, and by March, the US Army in Europe had recorded roughly 71,000 cold injury casualties, divisions worth of men, about 1 in every 20 medical admissions. And the gear existed. The shoe pack, a rubber-bottomed boot with a leather top that actually worked, was ordered too late and in too few numbers. Of 2 million sleeping bags promised for the winter, 57,000 had arrived by mid-September. And a survey in one hospital during the Battle of the Bulge found that 38% of the cold injury patients had never even been issued overshoes. 9 out of 10 victims were frontline riflemen, the one kind of soldier you can't quickly replace. In Patton's Third Army that November, for every 100 battle casualties evacuated, another 60 men went down with cold injuries, and in at least one regiment, trenchfoot losses passed battle losses. So what did they do? They dusted off the British playbook from 1915, pretty much line by line. On November 9th, the same day the first cases were reported, Patton issued a directive declaring that the most serious menace his army faced wasn't the enemy, but the weather. Dry socks started going forward with the daily rations, exactly like in Flanders. Foot inspections came back, men got rotated out to dry off, and in January 1945, cold injury prevention was formally made a command responsibility, and cases fell again. But for the men already hit, the numbers were ugly. The average trenchfoot casualty needed 83 days of recovery, and most who came back were only fit for limited duty, so their fighting war was over. And then came the insult on top of it. Most of them were denied the Purple Heart, the medal for wounds suffered in action. because trenchfoot was ruled a quote-unquote preventable condition rather than a wound. Preventable, sure, by men who were ordered to hold a flooded line and not allowed to leave it, while the boots that would have prevented it sat in warehouses. So the riflemen paid for that decision twice. Now you'd think that by the 1980s, with modern boots and modern gear, this story would be over. Well, 1982, the Falklands War, and it took the British about 25 days to prove otherwise. The land campaign to retake the islands ran through the South Atlantic autumn, with temperatures averaging around half a degree above zero, on ground that was pretty much one continuous waterlogged peat bog. The force lost most of its transport helicopters when the ship carrying them was sunk, so the Royal Marines and the Paras crossed the island on foot, hauling loads of around 100 pounds, soaked from the landing onwards, sheltering from shell fire in half-flooded holes dug into the peat. Sound familiar? A study later surveyed the roughly 3,000 Royal Marines who landed, and 64% of those who answered reported cold injury symptoms in their feet. In the infantry units, it was 76%, 3 men out of 4. And here's the detail that should worry every army on the planet. Between them, those men wore 46 different types of boot, and not one of them made a difference. Months after the war, tests found damaged nerve function in over a third of the men examined, and lingering cold sensitivity in most, including men who thought they were completely fine. By then, the condition had its modern medical name, non-freezing cold injury, but the new name didn't come with a cure. What it came with, decades later, was lawsuits. A serious case leaves permanent nerve damage, feet that burn or stay numb for the rest of your life, a body that can't handle cold anymore, and along with all that, lost careers and depression. The British Ministry of Defence has been sued over these injuries by hundreds of its own soldiers in recent years, with individual payouts reported in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. And the claims fall heaviest on one group, because the MOD has acknowledged research indicating that soldiers of African and Caribbean descent are around 30 times more likely to suffer a non-freezing cold injury than white personnel, with at least 450 Commonwealth soldiers reported injured this way in a single decade, many of them medically discharged or restricted to serving in warm climates. And the researchers say it plainly that the condition is still poorly understood, and there's still no definitive test to even diagnose it. And then the trenches themselves came back. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the front in the Donbass froze into static lines of trenches and dugouts. And by the first winter of the war, journalists at the front were reporting trenchfoot among Ukrainian soldiers. The descriptions could have been written in 1914. Constant rain and snow, roads turned to mud, men whose boots were never dry, one soldier saying his unit literally lived in a marsh. Volunteers ran warm clothes and dry socks up to the frontline units. So, more than 200 years after Larrey watched Napoleon's soldiers rot around the campfires, there's still no cure for trenchfoot. There's only the same defense there ever was: dry feet and dry socks.